Good morning and welcome. This meeting of the Illinois Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights shall come to order on May 31st, 2022 at 12 noon Central Time. My name is Cindy Buys, and I am currently serving as the Vice Chair of the Illinois Advisory Committee. Before we begin today's meeting, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge Asian American Pacific Islander History Month, a time when we recognize the contributions and influence of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders on the history, culture, and achievements of the United States. Unfortunately, discrimination against Asian Americans has deep roots in U.S. history. The first federal statute that excluded a group of persons based on their nationality was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. That act was followed by federal statutes that targeted persons of Japanese descent, leading to the wrongful internment of many Japanese Americans during World War II. During the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 60s, Asian American activists joined African Americans in speaking out and protesting over matters specific to their communities, including equal access to services and employment. Pan-Asian identity and community gained momentum after the 1982 murder of Vincent Chen, a Chinese American man who was beaten to death in a racially motivated hate crime. His death led to a federal civil rights case and marked a turning point for Asian American civil rights engagement. Other influential AAPI persons in U.S. history include farm labor organizer Larry Italong and other Filipino farm workers who helped bring about the creation of the United Farm Workers Union, along with Cesar Chavez and many Mexican American farm laborers. We are grateful for their work in leading the way towards a more inclusive and equitable society. Now, I would like to invite Evelyn Bohor, Support Specialist at the Commission, to assist with roll call. Committee members, if you are joining by phone, please press *6 to unmute yourself and then *6 again to place yourself back on mute until I call on you during the question and answer session. So I will now turn it over to Evelyn to conduct the roll call.
Hey, thank you. I'm just going to read down the list. Ryan Dunnigan, Jonathan Bean, Cindy Buys,
Present.
Mark Galaguas,
Present.
Trevor Copeland, Tabassum Halim, Rayad Kazmi,
Present.
Matthew Paprocki, Gregory Sanford.
Present.
Thank you very much. Also present is Anna Victoria Fortes, who is our designated federal official. The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights is an independent, bipartisan agency of the federal government charged with studying discrimination or denial of equal protection of the laws based on race, color, religion, sex, age, disability, or national origin, or the administration of justice. In each of the 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the 5 U.S. territories, an advisory committee to the Commission has been established, and they are made up of bipartisan persons who serve without compensation to advise the Commission on relevant information concerning their respective states and territories. Today is the third in a series of web hearings examining access to post-secondary education. We are taking a broad look into this topic and hope this meeting will inform us of various factors that require further examination and action. We are particularly interested in barriers to access that may disproportionately affect persons based on the personal characteristics listed in the Commission's authorizing statute. Using the information collected through this testimony, the committee will draft a report that will include findings and recommendations that will be shared with the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. The Commission will then forward these recommendations to the appropriate federal and state entities. Closed captions are provided for today's meeting. To access the captions, please click the 3 dots located in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. then click Multimedia Viewer. In addition, please note that this meeting is being recorded for the public record, and the web hearing recording will be available on our public database. You can contact Anna Fortes at afortes@usccr.gov if you wish to obtain those records. At this time, I would like to turn to our main program today, and we will be hearing from 3 speakers. Presenters, I ask that you aim to stay within about 12 to 15 minutes of your speaking time and reserve any additional talking points for the question and answer session if you are not able to address them within your main speaking time. Anna or Evelyn will be sending you messages through the chat box to let you know if you are reaching the end of your speaking time. After each presentation, the committee will have about 10 minutes to ask questions of the panelists before the next speaker presents. To ensure we have enough time for everyone, I ask both the committee members and the panelists to be succinct with their questions and answers. I will call on each committee member in alphabetical order to give you an opportunity to ask a question regarding the presentation. If members have additional questions, I'd like to ask you to use the raise hand function. And again, for members who are joining by phone only, you can press *3 to raise your hand, and you can unmute yourself by pressing *6. After all the presentations and the question and answer time, there will be time reserved for public comment. We invite members of the public to use the chat box located in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen to let us know if you would like to make a comment and to share your perspective on the topics we're discussing. With that said, I think we are ready to begin today's meeting. We will be hearing from Lisa Castillo Richmond, Executive Director, Partnership for College Completion. We will also hear from Will Del Pilar, Vice President of Higher Education, Policy and Practice, Education Trust, and Andrew Broy, President of the Illinois Network of Charter Schools. At this time, I would like to invite Lisa Castillo Richmond to begin.
Thank you. Okay, it looks like I have control of the slides. Thank you, committee members, for inviting me to speak with you today. My name is Lisa Castillo Richmond, and I am the Executive Director of the Partnership for College Completion. The Partnership for College Completion is an Illinois-based and Illinois-focused nonprofit organization established in 2016 that champions policies, practices, and systems to increase college completion and eliminate degree completion disparities for low-income students, first-generation college-goers, and students of color in Illinois, particularly for Black and Latinx students due to the student population in the state and the size of our historic inequities for these students. Our work on behalf of higher education equity falls within 3 primary levers for action. Number 1, partnerships with colleges and universities to provide targeted support to drive racial and socioeconomic equity in student outcomes. 2, policy and advocacy, largely at the state level, that focuses on equity, affordability, access, and accountability. And 3, data and research to support, inform, and uplift our work in the other areas. PCC's state policy and advocacy agenda is primarily centered in these areas of work. First, equitable access seeks to ensure that all students, regardless of race, family income, wealth, or where they live, have real and equitable access to high-quality post-secondary opportunities aligned with their education and career aspirations. The second area, affordability, is an important component that impacts access, persistence, completion, and post-college outcomes for Illinoisans. PCC seeks legislative solutions that ensure college is affordable for all and that low-income students can access college debt-free. This area of work also recognizes that institutions need sufficient resources to serve students and that disinvestment from higher education appropriations and need-based grant programs at the federal and state levels have a significant negative impact on affordability and access. The third area is accountability. For too long, we have treated the college completion crisis in this country as an individual failure or choice. Work within this area aims to strengthen accountability mechanisms for colleges and universities to take responsibility for equitably graduating all of their students without unnecessary barriers that disproportionately impact different student groups and reproduce existing inequities in society. Now I will summarize briefly on the higher education context in Illinois. Illinois is home to nearly 240 institutions of higher education. Currently, there are approximately 680,000 students enrolled in the state's colleges and universities, a reduction of about 37,000 students during the pandemic years. More than 1/3 of the state's college students attend one of Illinois' 48 community colleges. About 1/4 attend our state's 12 public universities. Nearly 30% attend our state's public nonprofit colleges, and another 50,000 students attend our for-profit institutions, which is the only higher education sector that has seen an aggregate increase in undergraduate enrollment during the last 2 years. Illinois has 3 higher education agencies: the Illinois Community College Board, Illinois Board of Higher Education, and the Illinois Student Assistance Commission. Funding is allocated to community colleges through 2 formulas each year during the legislative session. Currently and historically, there have been no funding formula for distribution of public university funding. The primary mechanisms we use to advance equity, access, and accountability in the state are through the appropriations process, MAP funding, operating authority for institutions and programs, and other state level programs with dedicated funding, such as the Minority Teacher Scholarship of Illinois. I want to focus the remainder of my time on trends in recent years, disparities, and solutions to highlight that only comprehensive, coordinated, and deliberate action to address these disparities will enable us to reverse these trends. In the past 20 years, disinvestment in and the underfunding of Illinois' higher education system has resulted in rising costs for students. The state has seen the greatest public university enrollment declines in the US. These declines have not been borne proportionately among the population. Among the impact of the resulting increases in tuition and fees has been the alarming decline in the enrollment of Black students by nearly 50,000 students over the past decade. Additionally, as the population of Latinx students has increased significantly, the number of additional bachelor's degrees for this group has not kept pace with population growth. Illinois went into the pandemic with a public higher education system in crisis. Though many states have disinvested in higher education, perhaps none have cut as deeply as Illinois. In addition to disinvestment, there are significant racial disparities in college degree completion and attainment among adults that must be addressed through supportive evidence-based policymaking and advocacy, along with a long-term commitment at the campus level to breaking down historical systems of racial inequity to address the root causes of these disparities. As you will see on this slide, there's a 32 percentage point disparity between where our 4-year institutions are graduating Black students and white students with bachelor's degrees, and more than 24 percentage point disparity in associate degrees, which represents a graduation rate for Black students that is less than 1/3 of the rate of white students. This disparity is nearly 18 percentage points in graduation rates for Latinx students pursuing bachelor's degrees and more than 13 percentage points for those pursuing associate degrees. When considering attainment rates among adults in the state who hold a bachelor's degree, Illinois is the state with the 11th largest disparity in attainment between Black and white adults and the 7th largest disparity in attainment rates between Latinx and white adults, with 20% of Latinx adults, 29% of Black adults, and 47% of white adults holding at least a bachelor's degree. These attainment rates for Black and Latinx adults have not narrowed in the last 20 years, despite increased attention and effort in college going in recent decades. In addition to and related to significant racial disparities in rates of completion and attainment are issues of access, affordability, and accountability. Since the year 2000, Illinois has seen a precipitous decline in investment in higher education. During this time, the state appropriation to higher ed was cut in half. As demonstrated in the charts on this slide and in one of PCC's recent reports, this prolonged disinvestment in the underfunding of Illinois' higher education system has directly resulted in shifting these costs onto students, pushing the dream and necessity of college out of reach for untold thousands of students each year. These declining state investments have resulted in all of our public universities, but our flagship institutions having the highest prices and largest enrollment declines in the country. Not coincidentally, these non-Research One institutions are also those that are most dependent on tuition and fees for funding. Illinois now has the unenviable position of the state with the second highest prices in the country for students from low-income households attending our less resourced universities. To put this in perspective, a student whose family makes less than $30,000 a year will pay $13,000 to go to a non-Research One university here. A similar student attending a comparable university in Indiana would pay more like $6,000 or $8,000 in Wisconsin. As Illinois has priced students out of college, we've seen the greatest enrollment declines at public universities of any state in the nation between 2008 and 18, and that has been entirely driven by non-Research One universities. Our 2 Research One universities have gained 6,000 students over the same time period. These institutions are also those that serve the lowest percentage of Black students in the state. As college costs have risen and been passed along to students, considering students' ability to pay becomes more important, and Illinois has large racial disparities when it comes to income and wealth. This leads to public universities costing the average Black Illinoisan 63% of their annual income and 41% of the average income of a Latinx Illinoisan, compared to 32% for the average white Illinoisan. We also know that wealth is even more important when it comes to paying for college. And while we don't have statewide data on that, we know from national data that wealth inequality is far greater than income inequality. Turning from affordability and toward access, PCC has been concerned with the barriers to access and racial inequity inherent in our traditional approaches to placing students in developmental education, as well as with the longstanding and effective models that stop students in their college pursuits just as they are entering the gates of higher education. Nearly half of Illinois community college students are placed in at least one developmental education course, with institutions disproportionately placing Black and Latinx students in these courses. The crux of the issue is that students are overplaced in developmental education, and once placed in these pathways, despite their significant efforts, these courses are not designed to support students in building skills for advancing into and through credit-bearing coursework and later graduation. Also, as you see here, very few students who begin in remedial education will graduate, with severe implications for racial equity as well. Turning to accountability and student protections, for-profit colleges represent the smallest sector of higher education, but they still enroll tens of thousands of students in Illinois. For-profit colleges target students who have the least ability to afford higher education and charge them more than any other type of college, despite little evidence on increased earnings and employment prospects compared to less costly alternatives. While for-profits serve less than 8% of Illinois students, they account for 1.7 times more in defaulted loan amounts than all public and private nonprofit colleges combined. They also represent nearly all fraud claims and failing or near failing programs. Finally, I will conclude with state and federal legislative recommendations related to these areas of work. In terms of state level solutions, one significant area of need is for states to have an approach that equitably appropriates funding while also considering adequacy and providing stability to institutions. Illinois is currently among the only states that does not have a funding formula for distribution of its public university funding. Less than half of the funding each year in Illinois is distributed to the 10 of 12 public universities that are most reliant on them. And these universities tend to enroll greater percentages of students of color and students from low-income households. This has increased the cost of attendance and narrowed access to our universities that are more reliant on state funding. Additionally, our most selective institutions have not been held accountable for serving representative populations of Illinois students that reflect the racial demographics of the state, thereby restricting access to students of color. Through the passage of Senate Bill 815 last year, a state-level commission is studying the issue to make recommendations to the state legislature for an equitable funding model in 2023. We must also increase funding to our community colleges, which serve large populations of low-income students and students of color, provide a critical starting place for many students in their college journeys, and have also experienced hundreds of millions of dollars in reduced appropriations during these last 2 decades. Access in the area of developmental education reform, increasingly states across the country are advancing legislation to use evidence-based models such as co-requisite support models of remediation and better, more predictive measures for placement. In Illinois, the Developmental Education Reform Act passed in 2021 and is in the early stages of implementation. There is still significant work that remains in moving toward implementation and scale. In terms of accountability, due to their poor student outcomes as it relates to debt, default, and fraud, we should phase out for-profit colleges' ability to receive state need-based aid dollars through the MAP grant. At the same time, we need to make sure the diverse ecosystem of public and private nonprofit 2- and 4-year institutions are meeting the needs of the diverse students in our state by offering programs, course offerings, timing, and delivery modalities that work for all students, adult students, returning students, working students, student parents, and others who have turned to for-profit education. And finally, affordability as a significant lever of access. Just as with the Pell Grant at the federal level, state need-based aid in the form of the MAP grant has been critically important for students in the college affordability equation. Illinois must fully fund MAP for all eligible students so that they can use these funds to successfully pursue college degrees and limit or eliminate the need for debt that compromises their future economic well-being. And finally, in terms of national legislative solutions, within access and affordability, Congress should incentivize developmental education reform through the Post-Secondary Student Success Grant Program. Students of color and low-income students are far more likely to be placed into non-credit-bearing courses where they are less likely to graduate. More than a decade of research shows that co-requisite remediation, for example, consistently doubles or triples the likelihood of students graduating. As a few states have succeeded in scaling this solution with impressive results, but many others have faced resistance. largely related to cost to implement these approaches and concerns over local control. The PCC encourages the Biden administration to include scaling co-requisite remediation or a solution with similarly proven results as a qualifier for receiving the post-secondary student success grant funds or as a high priority goal. Implementing test optional admissions in public institutions. The Biden administration should encourage states to implement test optional or test blind admissions policies as more and more state systems and institutions have done since the COVID-19 pandemic began. Doubling the Pell Grant. The Pell Grant is the foundation for the national investment in higher ed and helps millions of low and middle income students attend and complete college annually. As we continue through the COVID-19 crisis and its disproportionate impact on students of color and students from low income households, Pell is a powerful lever for affordability, access, and success. As the cost of attendance has increased, the purchasing power of Pell has declined to where it now covers less than 1/3 the cost of attending a four-year institution. By strengthening and expanding Pell, more students will directly be impacted by the life-changing grant program. Federal state partnerships for debt-free college. As college enrollment significantly increased through the first decade of this century, students are increasingly likely to come from lower income brackets and have greater financial need. These intentionally structured federal state partnerships bring additional funding to institutions to ensure college is affordable for students regardless of wealth or income, and are designed to serve students from low-income households well. These investments of new federal dollars can match state spending, taking into consideration a state's particular economic circumstances and incentivizing state participation, allowing for flexibility across states. Within accountability, the Biden administration should strengthen state and federal regulation of for-profit institutions by implementing and enforcing the gainful employment rule to ensure that for-profit institutions are accountable to students in terms of the value of their degrees in the labor market. Finally, by investing in the National College Completion Fund to expand and scale evidence-based practices for equity. Only with comprehensive, targeted, scaled evidence-based reforms will we see shifts at the institutional level that will add up to significant impacts in terms of increased numbers of college graduates, particularly for Black, Latinx, and other minoritized student populations in the U.S. Additionally, matching grant programs that require state contribution can double the funding directed toward these efforts. Thank you for your time and attention today. As I have shared, there are many areas in which civil rights protections must be strengthened in order for our colleges and universities to deliver on their promise of equitable access and opportunity to complete a college degree, rather than simply reproducing existing inequities across our society. Today, in the vast majority of places, race, income, and wealth continue to be the strongest determinants of college degree attainment. We must do more to break down institutional racism and eliminate the unacceptable status quo. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that information and data, very helpful. I'm going to go ahead and give the committee members an opportunity to ask some questions, and I will call on them in turn, and then I'll save my own questions for the end. So I will begin with Jonathan Bean. Jonathan, would you like to ask a question of this speaker?
Yes, hi. Lisa, I had a question concerning requisite remediation. You're critical of existing remediation as not being effective, not helping underrepresented minorities progress quickly to graduation. But clearly there are differences in college readiness. So could you spell out for me what you mean by requisite remediation?
Sure. So absolutely, and this is a longstanding historical issue. What we are advocating here in Illinois and encouraging other states to do is to take a look at evidence-based models, such as co-requisite models of support, which have the most robust evidence base. And essentially what they are is they give differentiated supports to students based on their skill building needs in English and math course sequences. So they eliminate, in many cases, for the majority of students, non-credit bearing traditional developmental education courses, and instead pair the first credit bearing course in the English and math sequence with a course that provides additional supports to students. So that could be a lab, that could be additional discussion-based workshops that are led by peers, like older peers, or that are led by faculty working in partnership with each other across the department. And so that's sort of what co-requisite models of support look like. They are differentiated. It isn't one singular thing. But also we argue that current placement procedures are trapping students in these cycles of ineffective developmental education in which students are unaware that they need to take a high stakes test after they may have, done well in high school and, in some cases even graduated at the top of their high school class, and end up taking a test that they don't know is a high stakes test upon entry into an institution. And this places them in 1, 2, or 3 levels of non-credit bearing coursework that then takes up aid, it takes up time, and many times is not successful in building skills in students so that they can enter into the first credit bearing course in the sequence. And there's significant data that shows that GPA, for example, cumulative GPA, is much more predictive than some of these standardized tests in seeing who needs additional skill building in order to go into the first bearing course in the sequence. And we would advocate that institutions should use measures that have that evidence of success in placement.
Thank you. I think it would help me and perhaps the committee as a whole if you could send us some information with examples on co-requisite remediation. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. Our next committee member is Mark Calaguas. Mark, do you have a question for our speaker?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Richards, for that very helpful overview. In terms of the proposed legislation or other funding proposals you've identified, either on the state or federal level, you or your org, which ones do you consider of the most urgent importance at the moment?
That's a good question. I mean, I think this committee is focused on access. And I think, what we've seen here in the state is that affordability is the most significant barrier to access. And so I think the programs, so the state need-based aid programs like the MAT grant, the National Pell Grant, the state partnerships, the federal state partnerships for debt-free college. I mean, those are really intending to incentivize additional investment at the federal level that then incentivizes state investment in higher education. I think, the conversation that's happening in Illinois with the Equitable Funding Commission for Public Universities is sort of looking at these issues comprehensively of, how do we address the issue of college affordability, which significantly impacts access, persistence, and completion. Pricing out low-income students and rising costs of college where our institutions sort of have no choice with this significant disinvestment, but to raise the cost of college, which we know has impacts on access, but in long-term debt outcomes for students. So I think the affordability issue at the federal and state level are some of the most important issues in addressing equity.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Next, I will call on Tabassum Halim. Tabassum, do you have a question for our speaker? All right, not hearing one, I will move to Rayad Kazmi. Rayad, do you have a question for our speaker?
Not a question, but a quick comment. Thank you for what you do, and thank you for coming here. There are, numerous organizations that assist and prepare youth for college from high school, but there aren't a ton, right, that assist those most in need once they get into college. It's kind of dependent on the school, and I know that from some of the students we've mentored that that's not always the best bet. So I just want to thank you for sharing this information, and I think it will help us in finishing up and wrapping up our report. So thank you.
Thank you.
Great. And then I'm going to ask Gregory Sanford if he has a question.
I don't have a question, but let me also echo my thanks for coming and sharing this helpful information.
Thank you.
So I did just have a couple of clarifying questions about some information that you mentioned. One was that, you mentioned that I think Illinois has lost 37,000 students since before COVID. And are there particular strategies to get students back into school that we haven't already talked about?
Yeah, I think the opportunity cost is a real question. I mean, we're seeing these in conversations we're having with college and university presidents and leadership teams that, especially in smaller institutions where they're able to engage with students and sort of, every 15, 20 student enrollment decline that they see from year to year has a very significant impact on their, operations. And what they're saying is, now you can go, down to Potbellies and, earn $15, $16, $17 an hour in doing these things. So our ability to communicate the value of a college degree and to be able to say with certainty that, our higher education system is affordable regardless of your family's household income or wealth, that we have strategies in place to make sure that that is the case, to have strategies in place to manage debt, so that doesn't impact, the long-term futures of our state residents. I think that proposition, we haven't been communicating very effectively, and I think we haven't had to do that because, for the past several decades, we've been in a period of dramatically rising enrollments. And now, both because of the demographic cliff that we're seeing and because of COVID and how that has impacted people in so many different ways and impacted the economy as well, I think that is something that we are going to need to be able to have an answer to as well.
Great. And you had mentioned a Bill 815. That's the one that creates the Equitable Funding Commission, correct? And then you mentioned a second bill that passed in 2021. But could you remind me again? I was trying to take notes, but I wasn't writing quite quick enough.
I was going very fast. The other bill I mentioned was the Developmental Education Reform Act, which was part of House Bill 2170 in partnership with the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus. It was a very large omnibus equity bill, and the Developmental Education Reform Act was a part of that.
Okay, great. And then I see that Tabassum does have a question for us, but we can't hear her. So she said she was going to put it in the chat. So we'll just give it a second, and if I can see her question in the chat, I can read it for her.
Her question is, what is the ratio of minority students in public versus private schools?
I do not have that data off the top of my head, but I could share that with you in my follow-up note with developmental education resources and research.
Okay, great. So I think that gave everyone a chance, and I don't see any hands raised. So I think we are done with questions for the moment, although we are going to come back at the end after we hear all three speakers and give the commissioners an opportunity to ask questions about anything that has arisen through the whole hearing today. So we may have more questions for you later. Thank you very much. All right, so at this time then, I think we will ask for Mr. Will Del Pilar, Vice President of the Higher Education Policy and Practice Education Trust, to provide his remarks. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Del Pilar.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Commissioners, I wanted to thank you for allowing me to share some of the research that we have done at the Education Trust on access to public 2-year, 4-year, and selective public universities nationally, but here I'll be focusing on our findings in Illinois. It's an honor to be able to share some of the disparities in access to post-secondary education for Black and Latino residents in Illinois. These findings come from 3 reports that we produced. The first was Broken Mirrors, Black Representation at Public Colleges and Universities, The second was Broken Mirrors 2, Latino student representation at public colleges and universities, and Segregation Forever, the continued underrepresentation of Black and Latino undergraduates at the nation's 101 most selective public colleges and universities that we published at the Education Trust. Next slide. The Education Trust is a national and state advocacy organization dedicated to closing opportunity gaps for low-income students and students of color, and we do that through research, policy analysis, and through coalition building. And so I'll first be talking about the Broken Mirrors work that we did. Next slide. And so in Broken Mirrors, I'll kind of quickly talk a little bit about what we did. We asked 6 questions of public higher education in each state, 3 questions on enrollment representation, and 3 questions on degree earner representations. Today, I'm going to be focusing on findings, 2 of the questions specifically in the findings for representation at public colleges, at public community colleges and public four-year colleges for Black and Latino students, and the findings for degree earners, degrees earned at the associate's and bachelor's degree level for Black and Latino students. Next slide. I do want to provide some context on how we defined Black and Latino residents in the state. We used current population survey to determine each of the benchmarks. For public community and technical colleges, the benchmark was based on Black and Latino state residents from ages 18 to 49 with no college degree, and they also didn't have to have a GED or a high school diploma, because it's not necessary to enter a community college. So you don't have to necessarily have a high school diploma in order to enroll at a community college. And at public four-year colleges, the benchmark was based on the same age range, 18 to 49, but you had to have a high school diploma or a GED and no bachelor's degree to be considered. Next slide. So this work, we really felt that public colleges that are funded by state taxpayers, we believe that colleges should be representative of state residents. And that's why the paper's called, or the report's called Broken Mirrors. Effectively, they should be mirrors of the state population and the diversity of the state. The findings from our report suggest that this simply isn't happening in Illinois. Next slide. What we did was we provided, so I'll quickly talk about what we did in this work and then share some of the findings. Each state received a performance score. The ideal score is 100. 100 means that the share of the students enrolled represented the state population of Black or Latino residents. Scores less than 100 indicate that Black and Latino student representation is below the benchmark. Scores greater than 100 indicate that Black and Latino student representation exceeds the benchmark, so they're over-enrolling Black and Latino students. Each state also received a grade based on their performance scores. So it's similar to the traditional grading scale. An A was 90 or better, a B was 80 to 89, a C was 70 to 79, and so on and so forth. Illinois earned, and this is specifically looking at the question, public community and technical colleges, Illinois earned a D+ on Black representation. 18.5% of residents in Illinois between the ages of 18 and 49 are Black, but only 12.8% of community college students are Black. Said more simply, we would expect that public colleges would be representative of state residents. To meet this standard, Illinois would have to enroll an equivalent percentage of Black students. But what we found is that there is nearly a 6 percentage point gap between what the expected enrollment should be and the actual enrollment. When we looked at the ranks, so we ranked states, in this study, we had a minimum of enrollment. So we actually didn't do the analysis on all 50 states, but Illinois ranked near last. It was 40th out of 41, and so ranked very poorly. Illinois did significantly better on this metric for Latino residents. In Illinois, 26.3% of state residents are Latino, and 24.4% of students enrolled at community college are Latino. While not perfectly representative, the gap between Latino residents and Latino students is significantly smaller. Illinois did much better on this metric. It ranked 3rd out of 44 states in enrollment representation at public community colleges. Next slide. When looking at public undergraduate enrollment of Black and Latino students at public four-year post-secondary institutions, what we found in this is that in Illinois, 17.9% of state residents are Black, but only 13.1% of students enrolled at public four-year colleges are Black. Illinois earned a C- on this metric. There's nearly a 5 percentage point gap of where they should be based on state demographics. Illinois was below the midpoint on this metric, ranking 17th out of 40, 17th out of 40th in terms of state rank. Illinois didn't do any better when enrolling Latino students at public four-year colleges. In Illinois, 20.4% of state residents are Latino and have a high school diploma and have no college degree, but only 14.3% of students enrolled at public four-year colleges in Illinois are Latino. Illinois earned a C- on this metric, and there was a 6 percentage point gap from where they should be to where they actually are. Illinois earned a 70 on this metric. Remember that a score of 100 represents enrollment equity. And when we look at the state rank, Illinois ranked 34 out of 44 on this metric. The next analysis that we did was very similar, but we looked at degrees awarded to see if Black and Latino students were being awarded degrees proportionally to their representation in the state. Next slide. So the first question we asked focused specifically on associate degree completers, and we looked at Black and Latino residents compared to the degrees being awarded at the state level. When we look at the share of degrees awarded, Black residents are underrepresented among associate degree earners. While 18.4% of residents in Illinois are Black, only 11.5% of associate degrees awarded went to Black students. Illinois earned a D in this metric and ranked 6th out of 40th. While the rank is relatively high, it is not a reflection of something that Illinois is doing right. It's simply a reflection of how poorly every state is doing around awarding associate's degree to Black students. Sadly, associate degree representation among Latino residents is not better. If we remember the earlier data point where Illinois earned an A on access for Latino students, this data point suggests that Latino students enroll at community colleges but don't graduate. While 26.3% of residents of Illinois are Latino, only 17% of associate's degree conferred go to Latino residents. Illinois is ranked 14th out of 44 on this metric. Next slide. When looking at degree share at four-year public colleges, Illinois institutions significantly under-award Black and Latino students bachelor's degree at the bachelor's degree level. In Illinois, 17.9% of state residents are Black, and only 10.5% of bachelor's degree awarded were awarded to Black students. Illinois earned an F on this metric, with nearly a 7 percentage point gap between where they are and where they should be. The story is significantly worse for Latino residents. 20.4% of eligible residents, 0.4% of eligible residents are Latino, but only 10.7% of bachelor's degrees awarded went to Latino students. This is nearly a 10 percentage point gap, which means that degrees awarded would have to double to arrive at degree equity. Illinois earned an F on this metric for Latino students and ranked near the bottom. Next slide. The second report, the second or third piece of work I'm going to talk a little bit about is our Segregation Forever report. In this study, we conducted an analysis of Black and Latino enrollment at the nation's 101 most selective colleges and universities. We examined the current state of access at these institutions and how access has changed since the year 2000. The comparison in this analysis is a bit more narrow than the previous analysis. We define the benchmark as the percent of Black and Latino students enrolled at the institution to the percent of Black and Latino 18 to 24-year-olds in the state. So the previous was 18 to 49. This is 18 to 24. We provide each institution with grades and scores for Black and Latino student access. We identified the 101 institutions using four criteria. One was 1150 SAT or equivalent. That would make you a fairly selective institution. 2, they were ranked as a state or were the state flagship. The third criteria was the Carnegie Foundation designation is more selective and higher research activity. And fourth, it was designated by its state as a public honors college. Different from the previous work I shared, we only looked at the eligible 18 to 24-year-old group. And these were folks with a high school diploma and no more than associate's degree. The grading scale is identical to the previous report that we used that I just shared, with a 90s being an A, 80s being a B, and so on and so forth. To provide an example, if 10% of your students were Black, but only 30% of 18 to 24-year-olds were the college eligible population of the state were Black, your Black student access score would be a 30, right? So 10% of your students are Black, but 30% of state residents are Black. You would get a 30, and that score would receive an F. Next slide. 2 institutions in Illinois met the criteria to be included in this report: the University of Illinois at Chicago and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. When we look at access at the University of Illinois at Chicago, access for Black students has actually decreased since the year 2000. When we look at data in 2017, Black residents in Illinois who were 18 to 24 with a high school diploma and no more than an associate's degree made up 17.7% of the population, but only 8% of the students at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Sadly, access for Black students at the University of Illinois at Chicago has actually decreased. In 2000, Black students made up 9.9% of the student body, a decrease of 1.9 percentage points. It's important to know that during the same period, the number of Black residents who met the benchmark actually increased by 2.4 percentage points. So it's not an issue of shrinking demographics. To have a representative number of Black students, the University of Illinois at Chicago would need to enroll an additional 3,240 Black students. The story for Latino students is significantly different at this institution. Latino students make up over 30% of the student population, despite only being 21.6% of residents in the state. Since 2000, the number of Latino students in Illinois has increased by 7 percentage points. And enrollment has not only kept pace, but nearly doubled. I'll say this may not be a reflection of something the institution is doing right. It may simply be a reflection of changing demographics in Illinois and a rapidly growing Latino population. Next slide. The story for Black students at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign is similar to what we saw at Chicago. Only 5.7% of students at the university are Black, despite the fact that 17.7% of 18 to 24-year-old residents in the state are Black. The university has taken a step backwards since the year 2000, when Black students made up 7.1% of students, despite there being fewer Black residents who met the benchmark. The University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign would need to enroll an additional over 4,000 Black students to achieve enrollment equity. Access for Latino students also fails the benchmark. While 21.6% of Latino state residents met the benchmark, only 10.2% of students at the university are Latino. Access for Latino students at the university has increased. It's nearly doubled since 2000, but this growth has not kept pace with the growth of the Latino community. To achieve enrollment equity, the university would need to enroll an additional 3,828 Latino students. Next slide. Illinois needs to do better. Black and Latino students deserve access to publicly funded institutions that provide the surest path to a good job and social and economic mobility. There are things that can and should be done at the federal and state level to close gap for students. And similar to some of the recommendations or policy solutions that were provided by Lisa from the Partnership for College Completion, we feel that the Pell Grant should be doubled. It's at its lowest rate in terms of covering the cost of tuition compared to the grant itself. Additionally, we were close, but we did not pass a federal-state partnership that would make college tuition free for students. If we double Pell and made college tuition free, students could use that Pell Grant to pay for non-tuition expenses like books and housing, transportation, all of those expenses that derail students from earning a degree. Additionally, we should explore canceling at least $50,000 of student debt. We know that the student debt crisis in this country deters a lot of students from considering or enrolling in college. Part of that is the affordability issue that Lisa discussed. But we know that student debt is a significant barrier, or at least even the consideration of student debt is a significant barrier for students. And additionally, we should be investing in the completion fund to support students to graduation. Many times students don't find or have the necessary supports to be able to get to graduation. President Biden proposed $125 million in his most recent budget request. And so we'd like to see that fund grow to support completion for students. At the state level, Lisa shared this, we should fully fund MAP. So all eligible students receive it. That's not currently happening and hasn't happened for years. We should create an equity-focused funding formula that provides additional resources to institutions that enroll and graduate higher numbers of students of color. We've seen states implement state test optional policies in California. For example, the University of California and the Cal State University system have both gone test optional and seen increase in the number of Black and Latino students who applied to the institutions. We're still waiting on enrollment numbers, but we know that the application numbers went up nationally when institutions use test optional policies. And finally, we need to be investing in counseling and pathways and in dual enrollment in P12. All the research suggests that I just saw 2 minutes, I'm almost done, that the students who take dual enrollment in K-12 are more likely to enroll in post-secondary education. They're more likely to graduate in 4 years, and they're more likely to get to college graduation. That's my last slide. There's some additional slides that will be shared afterwards that have additional data points on access in Illinois.
All right, thank you. It's really helpful to have all of this data, and I suspect that it will spark some questions from our committee members. So once again, I will go back and start alphabetically with Jonathan Bean and ask if he has a question.
Yes, in earlier sessions of our investigation, we were presented with Black and Latino statistics, but there was also a gender breakdown, which was pretty stark when it came to community colleges. So I'm wondering, can you speak to the gender element of it? We found that Latino males, for example, and Black males, but particularly Latino males, started community college but didn't finish. Are the women the ones that end up finishing, and how does that change the way we view the data?
There is significant disparities in enrollment by race and gender. We see, and I'll just say the national data suggests that the disparities have grown with males opting out of higher education. The National Student Clearinghouse has published some data that shows that we've lost nearly 400,000 students in higher education But a large percentage of that is actually males who, Latino and Black males generally, who are opting out of higher education. When we look at the data, Latina and Black women are going to college at higher rates and graduating at higher rates, but the move away from higher education for Latino and Black men is truly concerning. Part of that is, just a hot job market, but the other part of it is that there are a lot of folks who are exploring what other options for social mobility are that don't include college. And I'll say, part of that, and I think Lisa mentioned it, is the messaging on the value proposition of college. If I think I could be a social media influencer and not go to college, and I'm not going to take out this debt, I don't view it as affordable. And then we have a serious messaging problem in higher education. The data should be looked at. We should be disaggregating data. We've done it in some of our other work, but not in this work.
I have a second question. May I, Cindy? Yeah. I wonder how realistic is it to look at share of general population statistics applied to schools like University of Illinois or Urbana-Champaign, which are highly competitive. 33% of their undergraduates are Asian American and international, very high international percentage. Whites are underrepresented. There are, at these selective institutions, differential admission policies for underrepresented minorities. So is it realistic to expect the numbers to come out as they would in the general population is the first part of the question. And the second part is, given that these institutions do have affirmative action policies, what would your group recommend in terms of affirmative action?
So I'll address the first question. I think that if institutions have the will to enroll and look like the population of the state, they can actually do that. And part of it is actually in some of the data you presented. They have a strategy to enroll international students. They enroll a significant percentage of international students because they invest resources. They advertise internationally. They recruit internationally. And they do all these things that help them to enroll a higher percentage of international students. There's some research from Ozan Jaquette out of the University of California, Los Angeles, that shows that public flagship institutions do not recruit at the schools, the K-12 schools, that enroll more Black and Latino students and more low-income students. So institutions simply don't put the resources towards enrolling those students. It's also an affordability strategy. As the state has disinvested, they've had to go after more full-pay students. Those full-pay students are usually international students. And so institutions have a strategy to improve their enrollment of specifically of international students and wealthier students. They don't have that same strategy around low-income Black and Latino students. I think that if institutions as publicly funded public institutions should look like the state. So that is our stance. And so we feel that they need to look like the state if they're taking state tax dollars from people who Black residents pay taxes the same way Illinois residents pay taxes. The second part of your question, can you remind me? Because I got off on it.
The selective universities like the University of Illinois, they have
affirmative action.
differential admissions, affirmative action. Your numbers would look even worse from your perspective without those policies. So how does affirmative action factor into how your group views these issues?
Most of the research, and it's actually from the National Association of College Admission Counseling, shows that less than 10% of admissions use any affirmative action policies in admissions decision. So what that means is they're actually not using race overwhelmingly to make decision on admissions. They're using other factors that disproportionately impact Black, Latino students and low-income students. So some of the civil rights data at the federal level shows that schools, K-12 schools, that Black and Latino and low-income students enroll at overwhelmingly offer fewer AP classes. They have less access to school counselors. They have less access to highly effective teachers. Some of the research that we've done on K-12 in terms of school funding shows that Latino and Black students enroll at schools that receive $1,800 less per student annually for Black and Latino students. So we invest less in students in K-12, Black and Latino students in K-12. Then we don't provide them with the same access to resources that helps you get into a college. So if I don't have access to AP classes, if I don't have access to higher level math and science courses in a competitive admissions process, I'm not gonna have a chance to be admitted. I'm not gonna be competitive among those students. We need to be looking at other factors in admissions. At the federal level, I'm sad to say that I think that the affirmative action nationally will likely be struck down by the Supreme Court. And so I do think we need to be looking at alternatives and thinking about admissions very differently. If a student doesn't have access to AP classes at their school, what other resources are we supplying those students so that they could be in that competitive pool? Should we be investing in dual enrollment? We need more counselors at the K-12 level who provide supports to students. Illinois adopted a FAFSA completion policy at the statewide level, but did they put additional resources at the schools to help students actually complete the FAFSA? And so I do think we need to be doing these additional things to think about what do we value in an admissions process, and who are we effectively excluding by valuing those things in an admissions process.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Next, I'm going to ask Mark Calagwas if he has a question.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Del Pilar, for that deep dive. Just quickly, I'd like to revisit the figures you provided for enrollment in the public, community, and technical colleges. What struck me was the difference in the equity scores for Black and Latino students, and I think out of the different stats you presented, it seems to be one of the more pronounced disparities. Have you all started to maybe identify some possible causes for this particular stat?
In this research, we looked specifically at access. We didn't do a deep dive on what the barriers were, perceived barriers. But I think, we know that affordability is one of the biggest obstacles students face. There's a huge Black-white wealth gap in this country. On average, Black students just have less, Black families have less wealth and earn less. And so college is a significant investment and obstacle. We didn't look specifically at it, but we know that it's an obstacle for students.
Thanks.
All right, next I will ask Tabassum Halim if she has a question. And Tabassum, if you're still having difficulty with your audio, you can type in your question and perhaps Anna can read it for us.
And Tabassum, you can press *6 to unmute yourself. I know that you're joined by phone.
Are you able to hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Another wonderful presentation. There's so much to learn about the, all the data behind the disparities, and taken together with what Lisa had already presented, it really improves my understanding. A couple of questions would be, I appreciated the data points of 2000 and 2017. It would be useful to see the trend. 17 years is a long, it's a long period of time to see if there were fluctuations within those 17 years, and maybe it aligned with economic conditions that were going on or other reasoning. So that would be helpful to see data points in between. The other is we're obviously, as we delve deeper into these numbers, we realize that we're not even within the Black community or the Latino community, there's a lot of diversity. obviously. So it would be good to know what types of barriers. Yes, affordability is a big one, but it was very interesting to hear that even if students are able to have access to this education, they may prefer to go into a field that does not require, college, like you said, social media or some other. But so it would be good to know degrees offered at these public institutions versus employability and income. So if are they aligned? Are the jobs that are available out there, are they supported by what the colleges are offering? That would be good information to find out. And I mean, there's lots I would love to ask. I know there isn't time. The other point I wanted to make is it keeps going back to the decrease in funding to the state institutions. And it makes sense that they would try to pursue international students who pay the higher tuition just to be able to make a budget. From a self-interest point of view, it's understandable why state universities would do that. And so the incentives would have to change for the state institutions to be able to invest in their lower income students. So we would love to see, I would love to see, any improvements or any progress that you're able to make in changing that situation where the state is the state institutions have more access to state and federal dollars to reduce this inequality.
I'll say two things quickly. We haven't done that analysis, the labor market analysis, to look at how degrees are paying off for students in the labor market. But the college scorecard actually has really good data at the institution level. And it actually provides some information on major, like the average debt, and it also provides information on the earnings, average earnings for students who attend that institution and enroll in certain majors. Georgetown Center for Education and the Workforce has also done a look at specifically at majors and different earning potential based on the associate degree or bachelor degree earned in that field, and so they have some good data on that as well. The other thing I was going to say, incentivizing enrollment of low-income students. I just saw a bill pass, actually got signed into law in Illinois, that is going to provide a pool of an additional $25 million at the state level to try and incentivize the enrollment of low-income students at the state's public colleges and universities. A lot of times, we talk about carrots and sticks in the policy realm, and I think that when we think about a carrot, if an institution can get an additional $10 million or $5 million if they enroll a higher, I would say you can't incentivize just the enrollment piece. You have to incentivize the graduation piece, because we have over 34 million people in this country with some college and no degree. And so starting doesn't mean as much as finishing. And so I do think we do see some states creating incentives around enrollment of more low-income students. And in some states, through their funding formulas, if they have outcomes-based or performance-based funding formulas, we even see the certain benefits or a little bonus, like a cash bonus at the appropriation side if they graduate, for example, veterans, low-income students, adult students, students of color. And so that can also be done through a funding formula that incentivizes enrollment and graduation.
Great, thank you. We are starting to run just a little bit behind, but I would like to give our other two committee members an opportunity to ask a quick question if they have one. So I will now turn to Rayad Cosby and just say, do you have a question for the speaker?
No question. Thank you for sharing info. That a lot of us have a good amount of this from personal experience. So thank you.
All right. And then our last commissioner who hasn't yet had an opportunity is Gregory Sanford.
No question for me either. Thank you.
Okay. Well, you guys are going to help us get back on schedule. Thank you. And thanks very much, Mr. Del Pilar, for this great information. All right, so our third and final speaker today is Andrew Broy, who is president of the Illinois Network of Charter Schools. And so I will ask him to give his presentation at this time.
Great, thank you. Thank you to the commission members for inviting me to talk today. I'm going to spend a few minutes giving you some background about the charter school movement in Illinois, and then focus more narrowly on some of our college access, completion, and post-graduation work. To give you a bit of background, first slide, please. Our organization was founded back in 2003. We serve as an umbrella organization for all the 134 charter public schools in Illinois. We have three core focus areas. First is we work to ensure adequate and equitable resources for charter public schools. We're proud that this year, for the first time, Illinois passed a state law that provides facilities funding for charter public schools on a per pupil basis. It's the first time we've had that happen in 25 years in the state. Secondly, we work to ensure our member schools have the autonomy to find innovative approaches to meet student needs. And then finally, we try to establish a fair and transparent policy landscape that allows high quality options to thrive. Most of our college access and completion work is in the second bucket here, autonomy to find innovative approaches to meet student needs. To give you a sense of the charter landscape across Illinois, here are some figures I wanted to share. We have just over 62,000 public school students enrolled in charter schools statewide. Most of those are in Chicago, but we have good statewide representation. We've got schools in Rockford, East St. Louis, Peoria, DeKalb, and other parts of the state. Unlike other states, we have higher concentration of charter public schools in Chicago, mainly because our authorizing processes in Illinois starting 25 years ago prioritized chartering as a strategy to create high quality options for low income communities. And most of that focus starting in 2003 and 4 was in Chicago. Our population that we serve is heavily Black and Latino. In fact, 97% of charter public schools statewide are students of color. 85% of those students qualify for free and or reduced lunch. And a higher percentage of charter school students are actually special ed qualified than the general population, 14% to 13%. If you think about our college access work, I'd give you kind of 4 different phases of our work over the past 25 years. The first phase, from the first school opening up in 1996 through about 2010, focused quite heavily on trying to ensure opportunity and test score gains for charter public school students. Starting in 08 and 09, we worked heavily on college access between 2009 and 2016. We discovered after succeeding in college access that many of our students were not succeeding when they got to college. And so pivoted to do a lot of work on college completion 2016 to 2020. And now we're working pretty heavily on success after college, minimizing student debt, looking at post-secondary and post-collegiate opportunities, and trying to track students to see if they succeed in life after college. Here's a breakdown of the CPS student enrollment. We represent 18% of all public schools inside Chicago. At the high school level, we have a higher percentage. So in fact, 1 of 4 CPS public school students is enrolled in charter school today. Again, a high concentration of students of color and low-income students. If I put a map up on the chart, you'd see a heavy concentration on the west side corridor in neighborhoods like East Garfield Park, West Garfield Park, Austin, and North Lawndale. And then on the south side from Bronzeville down the South Shore are the heavy concentrations of neighborhoods where we have large numbers of charter public schools. This next chart I'll show you is a study we conducted several years ago that tried to look at how well high school students perform both on the ACT and then how they wound up doing in college. What you'll see on this chart is the x-axis represents ACT scores, and the y-axis is college enrollment, so 4 different quadrants. The blue dots represent charter public schools. The gray dots represent non-selective other public schools inside Chicago. And what we expected to see when we started this research is a pretty strong correlation between higher ACT scores and higher college enrollment. And you see that generally. If you put a trend line on this, you'd see clearly a relationship there. But we were more interested in inks in schools that had relatively low ACT attainment scores, but otherwise high college enrollment and persistence rates. Those are represented by the red box. And in those blue dots, we went to those schools and said, okay, you have not had much success getting your ACT scores up beyond the college minimum benchmark of 21, but nevertheless, you've had high success with those students enrolling and persisting in college, at least through the sophomore year. What are they doing? And from interviews that were qualitatively done over the course of 6 or 9 months, we produced a report that identified 5 different practices these low attainment, high performing college access schools had. And I've got those on the next slide. The 5 themes were first, reinforcement of positive non-cognitive skills. We had a school, for instance, in North Lawndale called North Lawndale College Prep that did this quite well, made sure that they reinforced things like persistence, things like showing up on time, making sure the college application process was engaged early on. Secondly, it made sure that every student in entering had tailored college counseling and matching. One of the findings we found about 10 or 15 years ago was that the schools we were sending our students to were not well matched to graduate students like the ones our schools serve. So a lot of our first generation kids of color going off to college were going to schools, colleges that did not have a good track record graduating that type of student. So we thought differently about college match and started sending them off to colleges that had a better track record. A third, most of the schools started the college-going culture from day one of freshman year by emphasizing teacher engagement with students, talking about what college they went to, doing FAFSA training for preparation of financial aid forms, all that sort of thing. Fourth, there was a counseling process to pair an adult to each student along the process. On average, charter public high schools are smaller than traditional public high schools are in terms of student population. And so there's a heavy emphasis on making sure there's adult relationships with each student as a benchmark for that. And then finally, tracking and support of alumni. The first few years of doing heavy college kind of persistence work, we found that a large number of our member students wound up going to college, and then for want of a book fee or administrative fee or a fine of sorts, wound up not persisting. So we did a lot of work to track and support alumni. In fact, some of our member schools even wound up financing cell phones for college-going students. They could call their college counselor back at the high school whenever they needed to. The next thing I'm going to talk about is more recent research we completed this year on whether schools are doing a good job preparing students to go and succeed in college. And we identified what we call beat the odds schools. We looked at every single public school in Chicago and then tried to find out schools that met 3 criteria. The schools were 90% students of color, were 90% qualified for free or reduced price lunch, and earned the highest rating on CPS's, what they call the SQRP, the school quality rating policy. Give you a sense of background there, that's a multi-factored rating policy that produces a summative ranking for every school in Chicago. It's common across all types of schools, so selective schools, charter public schools, military schools, theme schools, all get ranked on this SQRP model, with one exception, so-called option schools, which are dropout recovery and prevention schools that have a different system. But in any event, it looks at things like test score growth over time, enrollment rate, enrollment persistence, graduation rate, college going rate, and produces a summative ranking. We looked at the top individual score, which is 1+. At the high school level, there were 29 beat the odds high schools that met this criteria, and more than 2/3 of those were charter public schools. Even though charter public schools represent about 20% of high schools, they're about 3x overrepresented in these schools that have high poverty, high students of color, and yet earn a high rating on the CPS SQRP policy. We looked specifically at schools that beat the odds that were majority African American because both the SQRP rates and the college going and persistence rates for those schools were lowest of all the cohorts we looked at. And citywide, there are 61 schools, elementary and high school, that serve a student population that is both 90% plus African American and 90% FRL qualified. Charter public schools accounted for half of the majority beat the odds schools that met this criteria, and that we were more than twice as likely as district peers to be majority Black. And last slide, in terms of key takeaways from this research, both the first report I mentioned and the second one. One is that charter public high schools in Chicago have been catalysts for post-secondary success, regardless of the student's college entrance exam score. My previous panelists talked about how GPA is more correlated with college success. We've seen that too in our member schools. GPA tends to sort for the sorts of skills that wind up being useful in college in terms of completion rates. Secondly, charter high schools in Chicago are preparing challenged population for success in high school and beyond. Third, best practices they've been using have been used across Chicago for other schools. One of the promises of the charter movement years ago was that our member schools would serve as laboratories of innovation, and then the practices pioneered there would wind up spreading to other schools. That certainly happened in Chicago. Things like a longer school day, which was pioneered in CPS, was implemented in CPS in 2012. Ensuring a college or post-secondary plan was mandated by CPS 4 years ago. We've been doing that for the better part of 10 or 12 years. Looking at test score growth rather than attainment scores as a better measure of student learning and school evaluation. We've been doing that for 15 years. That's part of the SQRP, started in 2012. So we try to make sure that we're part of the CPS public school system and make sure we're contributing to what we know works for the students we're focused on. All right, glad to take any questions you might have.
All right, thank you very much. I think this time maybe we'll go in reverse alphabetical order, because sometimes if you're always the last person, then your questions are already taken. So maybe I'll start this time with Gregory Sanford and see if he has a question.
Thanks for starting with me, but I do not have a question at this time.
Okay, that's fine. Rayad Cosby?
I don't either. But Andrew, thanks for sharing this. But I will make a quick comment. I'm happy you shared this because obviously there's way more people who are knowledgeable about charter schools than I am. But quite frankly, until a few months ago, I did not know that there were public charter schools like this. And your whole organization being dedicated to that, I think, is pretty cool. I think there needs to be probably more opportunities for you guys. And I know that's not why we're here today. We're here just to gather information and then fulfill our requirements for the report that we want. But I think I would just say continue to do what you do. And we appreciate this perspective because oftentimes we kind of look at education as it's either a public school or a private school. So I appreciate you sharing this.
All right, then I will ask Mark Calagos if he has a question.
Sure. Thanks, Mr. Broy, for kind of sharing those insights on kind of how charter schools are, serving these high needs communities. One thing I've noticed from kind of the other panelists is they're identifying kind of affordability as a huge barrier. I was wondering for kind of the students that your charter schools serve, or maybe if your organization has kind of also looked into the issue of affordability, if if you've taken any positions on how to address this crisis.
Sure, I think it's a huge issue, particularly for the types of families our movement serves. One thing that was particularly tragic is when we did a research about 10 or 12 years ago, and we looked at the college choice in terms of the college MAC process I mentioned. What was making the choice for many, many individual families was wherever they got the most financial aid, without regard to whether that school had any track record serving first-generation college students and getting them through to college. And so what we've tried to do through a couple of philanthropic partnerships over the past decade is match up families that have additional unmet need with donors who can make the $3,000 or $4,000 annual contribution that steers them towards a college with a great track record serving our kinds of students. That has, I think, made a huge difference in the actual college completion rate. A lot of our students, I'll give you one example. There was a North Lawndale student who wound up getting a free ride to University of Wisconsin-Madison, but needed about $2,000 to go to a different college with a much better success rate. He wound up choosing UW-Madison for the financial aid and wound up dropping out a year and a half in because he didn't feel supported. The college did much to help him out. And I've always thought about that to think, boy, if we just had a couple $1,000s on the front end to make that student, or give that student the option to choose the college with a dedicated counselor, with better career tech work, with better support, they might have a different trajectory.
It's fascinating. Cool. Thanks so much.
Thank you. So I'll ask Tabassum Halim if she has a question.
Yes. My question is twofold. One is, given the success rate of the charter schools, what is the cost per student in a charter school versus a traditional public school? And secondly, is it something that we can scale up to include more schools outside of the Chicago area, so it benefits other areas as well?
Sure, great questions. For the first question, charter public schools are funded in the same way other public schools are, with one big exception. So we receive per pupil funding from the state and local taxing bodies on a formula basis like any other public school does. What we don't receive is per pupil facilities funding. And since almost all facilities are built with public dollars, for traditional public schools, we have to divert resources that are allocated with students to either pay a lease payment or pay off bonds we issue to build a building. So we wind up finding a gap. So in Illinois, the average per pupil funding for students is around $13,000 operationally. Charter public schools receive about $11,500 of that, and they wind up diverting about $1,500 per student toward the facilities costs. The budget allocation I mentioned earlier in my presentation will address about half that gap. So we're hopeful we can fill that up over time, but that's one of the practical challenges in terms of funding charter public schools. To your second question about outside Chicago, why there aren't as many schools, we worked years ago in 2011 to pass a law in Illinois that created a charter school commission at the state level that was allowed to grant charters across the state after a local district reviewed it and made a decision on it. That commission was disbanded despite our advocacy against that in 2017 and 18. Now the state board has some authority there, but we do need additional options in places across the state. I look at states like New York that has a high quality charter school sector. New Jersey does as well, DC does as well, and they have many more options of charter public schools across the geographic region of the state than we do. We've only got one in East St. Louis, two in Rockford, one in DeKalb. There are plenty of regional cities like the Quad Cities that have no public school options to speak of, and we'd love to see that happen through a partnership with local parents and community members.
Okay, and I will turn to Jonathan Bean. Jonathan, do you have a question?
I have just a quick question to follow up on the last question that was asked about the geographical spread of charters. You just mentioned that that commission was disbanded. Are there political headwinds facing the spread of charter schools across the state? Can you give us an explanation why the commission was disbanded, what support there is, and what opposition outside Chicago?
Sure. I think there are headwinds, both locally and nationally. To my great regret, charter public schools have become a political issue more than a policy issue. It pains me to say that because I spent 8 years of my career as a civil rights lawyer, specializing in desegregation and compliance work across the country. And I see my current work as very much of a piece with that work. The challenge with the commission specifically, it was that the way the charter school works is a nonprofit group has to be formed. They file a charter petition with a local school district. The district then decides to grant that charter or not, based on a series of criteria set forth in the law. The commission existed to look at that process and review and make a decision of whether that local district complied with the law. And they were empowered to overturn and grant a charter if they found a violation of the law. I'll give you an example. Back in 2015, we had charter applications that went into districts across Illinois, and these are usually 300-page applications, and they were voted on to be denied the next board meeting a week or two later. So clearly a local district didn't do much discernment or deliberation on that application. They just voted up and denied it. And the commission was designed to be a thorough process to look at it, use best practices, make a decision whether they met the bar, and then grant the charter. But it might not surprise you to hear that local districts didn't like the idea of a state body sitting in judgment of their decision making. And so many of them went to Springfield and pushed for this. We worked on it for 5 years with members that we worked with quite carefully. But at the end of the day, they voted to disband the commission back in, again, 2017 and 18.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Actually, my question is kind of related to Jonathan's, I think, and that is I'm trying to get a better understanding of what defines a charter public school. So, you know, could you just give me that basic definition?
Sure, happy to. So a charter school in Illinois is a public school granted a charter by a certified chartering authority. Those are either local school districts or the state board now, formerly the commission. So the state body can grant a charter or the local district can grant a charter. The charter itself is actually a written contract between the granting entity, usually the school board, and the nonprofit governing board that runs the charter. The charter specifies how the school is held accountable based on enrollment and test score growth and achievement scores and that sort of thing, and also details the autonomy and flexibility the school has. So I'll give you an example. Several years ago, a charter school was opened up in the Inglewood neighborhood of Chicago, and they were kind of a core knowledge type curriculum charter school approach. They wound up enrolling students who were well behind grade level in reading. In fact, they're entering ninth grade students were reading at a third to fourth grade level on average. The school wanted to implement double periods of reading instruction and English language instruction very quickly. The charter permitted them to do that in a way that a regular collective bargaining contract would not, given length of the school day. So that's one example of an innovation to deal with a student need that's direct, that a charter permits, that is not generally permitted in a broader framework. If you look at how in Chicago, for instance, public schools are governed, you have a single collective bargaining contract that governs every aspect of the school day. The charter itself allows the school and the local teachers to specify how they want to innovate, and some of them might use a different curricular theme, some might use a focus like college going, performing arts charters, all kinds of different approaches. But the real core idea is the charter contract exchanges increased autonomy and flexibility for a promise of accountability. And there's a 5-year contract generally that's renewable. And every 5 years, the charter comes up for renewal. If they perform well, they get extended. If they don't, they can be closed.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And so I know you said that the per pupil funding is the same as public schools in Illinois, although the facilities funding is different. Do students then also pay an additional fee? And if so, what's sort of the average fee that a family might pay?
No, there are no fees. Three of the criteria that distinguish charter public schools are: one, there's no admissions criteria permissible. So anybody can attend if you're of the age qualified. If there's too many students for the amount of space available, there's a random lottery conducted with every student having an equal chance of being admitted. Secondly, there's no tuition or fees, with the exception of some small fees permitted for every public school. So some schools have a book fee or a field trip fee. Those are permitted to the same extent they're permitted in other public schools. And finally, there can't be any retention criteria that would keep a student from being able to enroll year over year. So the discipline policies, for instance, have to comply with local discipline policies other schools have. Exceptional students like special needs students also have full access to the suite of FAPE in a public school as they do in a charter public school.
Great, thank you. All right, so we are going to move to our public comment section soon. However, now that we've heard from all three of the panelists, I want to give the committee members one last opportunity to ask questions that might have come up in your head of any of the three panelists this afternoon. And then we'll have just a few minutes for that, and then we'll move to our public comment portion. So committee members, I'm just going to throw it open. If you have a question, you can raise your hand or speak up. All right, I'm not seeing any raised hands, so I think that we will now go into our public comment. And this is an opportunity for the public to offer comments to the committee about this topic. We do ask that you keep your comments limited to 2 to 4 minutes. If you would like to make a comment, please either raise your hand by hovering your mouse over the smiley face, then click raise hand, or type in the chat the word comment. If you are joining by phone, you can press *3 to raise your hand. Please know that you can also submit written comments by email to us through Anna Fortes at afortes@usccr.gov. So let me just give a moment to see if we have any public comment. Okay, it looks like we do not have any public comments at the moment. So we do thank those that joined us today in participating in the hearing, even if you weren't moved to make a public comment at this time. We do appreciate the engagement of all of our committee members, the public, and we especially appreciate our speakers who spoke today and sharing all the wonderful data that they provided us with and information. And finally, I would like to thank our staff, Anna Fortes and Evelyn, who helped us today with the hearing. Thank you so much. We will keep all of this testimony and data and the comments that we receive in mind as we move forward to draft our report and recommendations. So thank you again, everyone. Just excellent information. So I wish you all a great rest of your day. Committee members, if you could stay on the line just for a couple of minutes, that would be great so we can plan our next steps, but everyone else is free to leave as they need.
Okay.
I think, Anna, we've got everybody in the right place right now.
Yes.
So should I turn it over to you to talk about next steps?
Yes. So the first agenda item here is just a reminder about our Monday.com board. I had invited everyone to this board. Let me just pull it up one more time to make sure that you all are familiar with the view and just how to access the various boards. You should have access to 3 boards. Let me just do this really quick. Okay, so you should have access to the Illinois Public Board. Here you'll find all of the materials for each of the meetings. You'll find the recording along with the PowerPoint slides, any the FR notice, which is the Federal Register notice, any articles that were referenced during the web hearing, or just generally any materials referenced. The second board here is the testimony highlights board. I will be asking that you provide some highlights that you, any notable testimony that you found specifically interesting that should be included in your report. I will be basing your report off of what will be included in this highlight section. I know that Cindy had prepared a document, I believe it was before the last web hearing to kind of that summarized some of the testimony, and so I can add that here. But I strongly encourage you all to take part in this because you will be noted as the authors of the report. This is a committee report, and so as much engagement as you can provide is truly helpful to this process. And then the next board is some draft findings and recommendations. Based on these testimony highlights, we will be identifying some findings as well as recommendations. And so this is where you can kind of house some general ideas that you may have. If you want to just, note it in kind of bullet points or just sort of just shorthand, I can try to decipher that. What is really helpful for me is if you can identify the speaker, if you can identify the page number within the transcript would be really helpful. I will say that I'm generally the primary drafter of reports, although I do welcome committee members to assist with drafting as well. I know that in my other advisory committees, I've had 2 or 3 other kind of co-drafters with me, and the rest of the committee is, of course, asked to review the full draft of the report. But it's really helpful to have a few people help with the initial draft. And so I'm hoping to pull from anything that you've included in the findings and recommendations, and I'll add that into the report. The second thing that I wanted to kind of go over is the project timeline. As you know, you all drafted your project proposal back in 2021, in the summer of 2021. We are currently in what we call the implementation stage or the planning stage, where we've organized the hearings, we've heard testimony, and so that started back in January, and then it'll continue up until June. I added June here because I would like to have another meeting where we reflect on testimony, and that usually is just helpful in the event that no one has included anything in the Monday.com boards, because I do want to get some reflections from the committee about about your kind of interpretation of some of the testimony, any questions that you may have for the speakers, any follow-ups, any perspectives that you find might be missing. This will be an opportunity for us to kind of discuss that further. In July, I hope for us to begin the report stage of this project process. It'll continue hopefully into October. And so my goal for you all, and this is certainly, dependent on everyone's availability and sort of just, changes to my schedule as well. But what I would like for us to aim for is to have our first draft available in mid-July, the second draft available in mid-August, and then the third draft will be in September, mid-September, and then we'll either vote at that third meeting in September, or if we need to, we can move it to early October. Following that, what happens is we will send it to our Office of the General Counsel for them to conduct a legal sufficiency review. That typically takes about a month and a half, depending on their workload. And so it's likely that we'll have a report available by the end of the year. And then following that stage, if the committee would like to conduct some sort of post-report activity, we can discuss that, and that could happen anytime in December at the end of the year, or January, or we could even, move it to perhaps the spring, depending on kind of the enthusiasm of the committee. And some ideas in terms of post-report activities are drafting an op-ed, kind of reiterating some of your recommendations. Committees have also done sort of like press events where they invite various stakeholders and present your findings and recommendations to them. And then also one other thing that's recently come up is adding or drafting an addendum to their report in the event that there are updates in, let's say, the legislature, or perhaps there is a recent event that might kind of reiterate or reinforce some of the recommendations that were agreed upon by the committee, and it sort of just demonstrates the importance of the topic. So those are some things that we can consider once the report is finalized. But just so you know that there is an opportunity for a follow-up activity. And it's mainly to elevate the report and, increase awareness about some of your findings and recommendations. So that's what I have in terms of project timeline. I will pause here before I move to the third agenda item. Do any committee members have questions? Any reactions to the schedule here?
I will just say it looks fine with me.
Okay. So moving on to the third agenda item, what I would like to do is send out a poll, scheduling maybe about 3 meetings in advance, just so we have it on our calendars. It's really important that we have the majority of members present at these meetings, if not the majority, then all members. I do want, your engagement as much as possible. And I know that if, in the event that something comes up, if you're unable to, participate in these meetings, I will be asking that you submit track changes, any, comments that you might have, any reactions to the draft. That way that you can still stay engaged, even if you're not present at the meeting, the monthly meeting. So please know that there are opportunities for you to participate. And then I'll just make a note. I'll just note also that once we start deliberating on findings and recommendations, you all will be, there will be a lot of discourse on on deliberating recommendations in particular. If there is opposition to anything in the report, really, we do have a process for you all to draft a concurrence and a dissent. So if for example, if you do agree with the report, but feel that there were, I suppose, some concessions that had to be made, but would like to add additional context or research that you found that was supposed to be added, or that you wanted to be added in, you could draft that in, you can include that in a concurrence. The same goes for dissent. If you found that there were some recommendations that should have been included, or if you disagree with the report, that's an opportunity. In that space, you have an opportunity to voice your opinion. That will be included in the report as well. So I just wanted to share that because, in this process, we know that not everyone will agree, and that there will be some, discussions and kind of concessions that you'll have to make in order to reach a consensus. And as you know, a majority of the committee has to vote on the report in order for it to move forward. So that's sort of our process. Any questions about the project timeline and then scheduling meetings going forward? Or I should also add, and using the monday.com board. Okay. Well, my final note is I will send out a poll and let you know, just sort of kind of summarizing our discussion. I know not all members have joined today, so I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. Please let me know if you have additional questions. Also, let me know if you think of any questions that you might want to ask other speakers. I can certainly follow up with them and pass along your question.
Thank you very much, Anna. And I'll just say again, I really appreciate the committee members coming today and participating in the hearing and your good questions. And you know, I think there were some themes that we heard quite regularly that will lend itself well to some reporting and recommendations.
Great. So that's all I have, Cindy.
Okay, then I think we're done for the day. Thank you again, everyone. Enjoy, I hope, a beautiful day wherever you are. And we will look for Anna's poll to set our next meeting to sort of reflect on the testimony that we heard today. I will try to also sort of gather my thoughts maybe in writing and share them with Anna as I did before, and maybe that will help spark some discussion too, or focus the discussion a little bit.
Thank you, Cindy.
That's good. Thanks, everyone.
All right, bye now.